We're going to get started here today. We've got a great panel for everyone here that's in the room and watching online. I've been really looking forward to this discussion for the whole week. My name is Patrick Crowley. I'm the president of the Rhode Island AFL-CIO, and I'm also the co-chair of Climate Jobs Rhode Island, and I'll be a moderator today. And I'm going to ask the panel if they would mind introducing themselves, and I'm going to start to my immediate right with Daniela, and we'll go right down the line. Why don't you say your name, who you are, and some of the things that you work on?
Sounds great. Daniela Fairchild, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for the Rhode Island Commerce Corporation. We are the state's quasi-public economic development agency, so we help small businesses, big businesses, folks coming to Rhode Island, folks looking to expand in Rhode Island, our targeted industries, and everybody in between. I was just at the SBA's Small Business Luncheon celebrating some of our small shops. You know, we have lots and lots of micro businesses in state as well. So we're here in case anyone needs anything. But I think why I'm on this panel is because another hat I wear is supporting the region's Ocean Tech Hub. Rhode Island really is a hub for undersea and surface ocean technologies, particularly autonomous vehicles. We've got a massive supply chain, a huge legacy of shipbuilding and marine innovations, and excited to be on the panel and talk a little bit more about what we've got going on in the ocean economy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Harry Antone. I am the Labor Liaison and Offshore Wind Coordinator at Climate Jobs Rhode Island. Climate Jobs is a coalition of over 30 environmental, labor, and community organizations, all working towards a just transition to a green economy in Rhode Island. And I work primarily with our community partners and our labor partners, specifically engaging with our rank and file to really how they see themselves as true stakeholders in this just transition.
Hi, everyone. Aislinn Hanley. I am the program director with Climate Jobs Rhode Island. Harry gave a great summary, but we work on policy in the energy space, making sure that we deploy renewable energy at the scale required, but also making sure that those projects have good jobs and strong standards attached to them.
Good afternoon. I'm John Kastrinos with Hanley and Aldrich. Hanley and Aldrich is a geotechnical engineering firm based in Boston, and I lead the geothermal practice at Hanley and Aldrich. We've done geothermal work all over the Northeast, basically from New Jersey to Maine, and we are currently working for URI at both their Kingston campus and their Narragansett Bay campuses, looking at geothermal feasibility in one case, and actually designing a system to serve buildings in the Narragansett Bay campus. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. One of the reasons why I'm looking forward to this discussion is because we're really at kind of like bookends of where we are here in the ocean state. I mean, Rhode Island has 400 miles of coastline, and even though our model is the ocean state, in reality, we're also a very heavily forested state. We are an urban state, but we're also a very rural state, and we have so much going on in this economy and in the state in terms of the green and the blue economy. It's something that I think we can celebrate, even while we've talked about in other panels today. There's been a lot of pressure from the federal government to kind of change our direction, and I don't think we really need to. But this discussion, I think, is going to be great, because if you think of the kind of really existing elements of our economy, we're talking about the ocean economy. And yet, when we're talking about the next steps in decarbonizing our economy, we can talk about geothermal and how those things can maybe intersect. So, Daniela, I wanted to start with you. As some people may know, I also sit on the board of directors for the Commerce Corporation, so I'm really familiar with the work that we've been doing in the ocean economy. But why don't you give us some of the highlights of what Commerce has been doing to spur growth in this industry, and talk a little bit about the Ocean Tech Hub in specifics?
Absolutely. So the Ocean Tech Hub is a federally designated tech hub. We're one of 31 in the country. There were about 400 applications, and regions went out and said, hey, we are really good at X. You should designate us around bioscience or next-gen materials or quantum computing. We raised our hand and said, we have a legacy and a core set of companies focused on ocean economy, ocean technology. You should designate us. And the Fed said, actually, yeah, that's a great idea. You are going to be designated as the Ocean Tech Hub. We're the only tech hub in the country designated to focus on subsea and surface autonomy. What that means and what it builds off of are hundreds of companies in our supply chain, as I mentioned, that are doing things related to advanced materials and composites and shipbuilding. So the hulls that encompass the technologies that go inside. Had I think of something you brought up about wind and some of our efforts for renewable. What's really nice is where we can find synergies, even with where the administration is focusing energies. The Tech Hub is doing a lot with, again, autonomous systems, so battery powers. These are systems run electrically. They're not run on diesel or other. So how are we doing next-gen ships and next-gen autonomous vehicles with batteries, which, by the way, are necessary for all of our renewable energy efforts as well. So finding those synergies. In the region, a couple quick stats that I love to share, and then I can nerd out on more stats later, but I'll give the floor. We did a market analysis in 2024 and found that globally, the region accounts for 10% of all autonomous systems deals. So all deals that happen, all trades and buys and everything else in the autonomous undersea systems world, 10% happens in this region. And if you look at advanced materials, the composites, the hulls that make that happen, and that will help drive our wind turbines and everything else, right? Those great materials, 16% are in this region. So we really have we punch outside our weight class locally when you think about these opportunities. And we're really looking to capitalize and continue to grow. And we've seen massive influx of companies and growth and support of our current companies. I said last thing, but my one last example, again, you got me talking. My one last example is just this week, one of our shipbuilders, Senesco Marine, that's been in Quonset for a number of years, a great local company, great small business, is partnering with Havoc AI, which is a new startup coming into Rhode Island, growing in Rhode Island, to build a new class of autonomous ships, and just announced that this week. And you talk to the teams and they say, we're really able to capitalize on legacy, draw in new innovation and talent, and that couldn't happen in scale anywhere else as quickly because of the supply and the systems and the structures that we have in Rhode Island.
Thank you very much. No, I mean, it's really important when we talk about creating a new carbon-free economy. Oftentimes, the big projects take center stage in that discussion, the offshore wind projects, the solar farms, what have you. The reality is that if we're going to build a new economy, it's going to take people that are making component parts. It's going to be R&D on next generation material that people don't read about on the front page of the Boston Globe or hear about on the next YouTube broadcast. But all of these things are critical to the things that we need to build this economy from the bottom up. Now, John, at the other end of the spectrum is kind of like the next stage of things with geothermal. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit more about what the work that you're doing, where you see the potentials for this kind of work, especially here in Rhode Island?
Sure. Thanks, Patrick. So I usually start these discussions with what geothermal is not. Right? Geothermal is a bit of a misnomer. So out west, California, Nevada, other parts of the world that have real heat underneath the ground surface, they harness that heat to drive turbines and feed the electrical grid. Now, we don't have that. So some people say, well, how does geothermal even work in New England, right? But what we do is what I would call low temperature geothermal. It's for heating and cooling. So you're essentially borrowing heat from the earth to heat the building, right? You're circulating fluids beneath the ground to depths of, say, 500 to 1,500 feet. And then you extract the heat to heat the building. It runs through a heat pump, much like mini splits or air source heat pumps, if you have those in your house or place of work. And then in the summer, you reverse the cycle. So you're essentially pulling heat out of the building and rejecting it to the subsurface. So why geothermal works so well in Rhode Island and really all of New England, a lot of it is geology and some of it is our climate, right? So starting with geology, compared to other parts of the country, our water table is quite shallow in this area. And saturated soils or rock have much better thermal exchange than dry soils will, right? So that's one thing we have going for us. The rock is shallow. Now, it's not the same depth everywhere, but it's shallow compared to other parts of the country where you have to drill thousands of feet to get to rock. And the thermal exchange in rock is much better than the overlying soils. So again, that's a real benefit to, and then the types of rocks, right? The hard rocks of Rhode Island are really excellent for thermal exchange, and that translates to a very efficient system. And then in terms of climate, for most of the systems we build, which are called closed systems, you really want a balance between heating and cooling. It doesn't work so well if you're down in Florida or Arizona where it's all cooling, right? Almost no heating. You want that balance, that seasonal balance, to keep temperatures within a certain range and keep it efficient for long-term operation.
Great, thank you. It's kind of remarkable when you think about what both of you just started off by saying, that it's essentially using the natural geography and location of where Rhode Island is as an asset for our energy production needs and our energy usage needs. It's not an unprecedented way to look at the economy. You know, for 150 years prior to really the Industrial Revolution, Rhode Island did that. We used the natural resource. Now, unfortunately, that natural resource was whales. You know, but people forget that for almost a century and a half, the United States was powered by places like Rhode Island and Nantucket and the coastal areas in this area to give us our power. We had to harvest animals to do it, but now that we're back into this idea of using our natural geography to our advantage, the resources just seem really unlimited. So it's an important part of the conversation. I don't think gets talked about that much. Now, Aislinn and Harry, your work with Climate Jobs Rhode Island is kind of at the intersection of all of this economic work, but with the workforce that we're doing. So I'd like maybe for the both of you to talk about this a little bit, but Aislinn, we'll start with you because, Climate Jobs Rhode Island has been advocating for geothermal transition work over the last couple of years, but even more specifically, recently in the last couple of years, the city of Providence has taken a lot of steps to incorporate that into their options. Could you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. So, as Pat said, thermal energy networks have been a really big policy priority for us for a few reasons. From the workforce perspective, those skills that you would need to work on a geothermal system, specifically a thermal energy network, those skills are already possessed by our tradesmen and women. So it's a pretty seamless transition from working on the gas system into a thermal energy network. So that's really where we see a huge benefit of moving workers from these fossil fuel jobs, which have been traditionally very high paying, good benefit jobs, into thermal energy networks. As well as you mentioned, right, we're in a great region geographically for this work to happen, but also in Rhode Island, because of our density, that's a really big opportunity for a thermal energy network as well. Air source heat pumps are great, right? But what if you can make that a networked district where you have, for example, like up in Framingham, Massachusetts, you're putting commercial businesses, you can put industry, you can put residents all on the same system and balance the load that way. So we are pursuing that legislation both at the state level, but also locally with Providence. Providence has done some really cool things in the climate and labor space over the last couple years. But one of which is their carbon neutral ordinance, which says that all of their public buildings will be net zero by 2040. Now, there's no specific pathway for what that means. That can be a mix of resources. But Providence has been really a leader in this space of looking at, well, we have all these buildings that we own in this one area. Can we connect these? And you look at an area like off of Allens Ave where they have the Narragansett Bay Commission, you've got the animal shelter, you have the Department of Public Works building going there. Now they're looking at solar, they're looking at heat pumps, but you have these real opportunities and high density there to put both city buildings, households, other commercial industries right on that network. So we're pursuing that really at the local and state level, and it was one of the few technologies left untouched by the Big Beautiful Bill. So there are still those credits available to receive back for geothermal through 2032, I believe. So there's a lot of opportunities remaining there.
Harry, what would you add for that conversation?
I think when we're talking about building a new economy and putting power behind that, we have to think about the people, right? And not only the people that are going to build it, the people that are going to create a movement around it to move the economy forward. And that's a lot of the other side of the work that we do at Climate Jobs. It's engaging with our fossil fuel legacy tradespeople and having them envision themselves as true stakeholders within this new economy, right? So that they can fight for those good jobs and we can move that economy forward. So that's another large part of our work is how do we uplift that workforce and how do we build a movement behind it to move it forward?
Can I jump in? I think on the workforce front too, the thing that we think about and are working on within the Ocean Tech Hub, we have a lot of folks working in tangential or connected roles that may or may not even know about the opportunities. So when we think about, transitioning folks from fossil fuel based or other roles, understanding, making sure that they even know that these opportunities around geothermal, you were noting, right, that a lot of times it's for Nevada or Idaho or wherever, it's not around here, but knowing these jobs exist and what those pathways are. I'm going to give a shout out. I do this every time I see Nishita, but a shout out to Nishita, who's in the audience. She runs a series of programs, an organization that provides opportunity for predominantly younger folks to see themselves in the Ocean Tech Hub jobs and other, targeted industry jobs. But we hear this all the time. That's sort of like, oh, I'm a machinist, but I didn't know that I could be a machinist working in these fields. Oh, I'm a welder, and I didn't even know I could do underwater welding. Or I'm a, and so like finding those ways to elevate, and these events and things like this are really helpful for just getting the word out that people may not know that geothermal is even an option, and helping to help that pivot just in terms of awareness, I think is super important because we see it constantly in our world.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right with the exposure. And one other thing that I'll add is a lot of our rank and file members transitioning to this, there's a lot of excitement and pride that comes with that. And we hear that over and over again. And that's some of the most impactful things as we have fights on offshore wind, to really bring those narratives alive because they are so prideful of what they do.
And can I add on to that? With thermal energy networks, there's a lot of work to be done in construction, but also in operations and maintenance, which we don't necessarily see with every renewable energy. But also from the community side, especially in Providence, you have areas that are environmental justice communities, that you have a lot of tenement buildings. You have the hospital zones, right? So where you can really have an opportunity to add on to that system. But also for community members, we know as a state, as a country, it's kind of scary to be like, yeah, we're going to totally change how we power on our economy. It's a really big thing to do. But when you're able to offer a technology that is affordable, is reliable, that will lower your bills, that's the way to do it.
Just sticking with that theme for just a minute, because you're right, it's not just the construction workforce. It's also CPAs. It is classroom teachers. It is folks that do computer programming. It is folks that do, front office work, back office work. The opportunities in terms of talking about building a new economy are not located simply in project to project type work. It really is a whole broad-based economy that we're talking about trying to recreate here. And, John, you mentioned it in your opening remarks, and then Daniela, I think it'd be helpful to hear from you about this. In your work in this area, how are you partnering with places like the University of Rhode Island or other local higher ed institutions to make what you're trying to do a reality?
Yeah, it kind of depends. So a lot of universities have some very ambitious decarbonization goals. And so what we'll start with is a feasibility study that is very much a desktop exercise, because the cost of not only implementing a geothermal-wide district, but having all of the buildings set up so that they're compatible with it is daunting, right? It can be hundreds of millions of dollars, because when you're talking about multiple buildings, one of the advantages of a district is you can balance out the heating and cooling. So but depending on the load profiles of the individual buildings, right? So if you have some lab space that's very cooling dominated, for example, that can balance out several dormitories that are heating dominated. But there's a lot that goes into it before you even drill a single hole. So the temperature of the what's providing the heat, right? Geothermal is not compatible with steam. So in many cases, these universities will need to invest in converting to low temperature heating systems, then as well as striking that balance. And then of course the building envelope, as with any decarbonization or electrification strategy, you don't want to throw good money after bad. So you want to make sure the envelopes are as tight as they can be so that they're the most energy efficient they can be. So that's kind of a desktop study. And then at the other end of the spectrum, with new buildings, they might have a standalone system just to serve that building. And there's a lot of design work that goes into how many boreholes do we need, how much footage do we need in the ground, and what's our target for heating and cooling to be carried by the ground. It's seldom 100%. It usually doesn't make sense for it to be 100%. So we work closely with the universities, their mechanical engineers, the architects to figure out what makes sense, what's an optimal size of the system.
And I think how we partner with URI, with others, is multifold. One is around workforce and awareness. As you noted, right, we've got folks across the spectrum. URI particularly has a ocean engineering program. They graduate 300 engineers annually. And a bunch in the ocean engineering program. So bringing in those folks to our market. I already mentioned Nishida and Courage Builder and the work that they do to get, they do a lot of partnership with URI as well to get awareness into the professions. But then we've got the actual R&D and the new tech, and making sure that we're staying on the cutting edge of how to be most efficient, how to best retrofit our old buildings in New England so that it doesn't become throwing good money after bad. Are there ways that we can rework a steam pump to do something, right? And so at Rhode Island Commerce, we have a program called the Innovation Voucher Program. We do a lot of collaboration with URI, but other knowledge providers or other higher ed institutions as well. That's up to $75,000 non-dilutive, so cash grant to businesses to do R&D, typically in partnership with a higher ed institution, but sometimes if you're a manufacturer, you can do in-house. So we sort of multi-pronged. We want to do R&D and stay keeping our university's core with us as we're identifying the next technologies that are going to be able to drive this work forward, and making sure that we're partnering with them to build awareness and to upskill and continue to skill our next gen workers. And I would name also, as you talked about, the holistic nature of all of this, and we give a shout out again to URI. They recently launched a Blue MBA program as well. So tying in, your point on CPAs and our accountants and everyone else who has to be a part of this, getting our business folks to be thinking about how they're engaging in our clean energy future, along with how they're going to their business school and getting their, fancy jobs.
Very fancy jobs. But it's funny, John, you mentioned something that if my brother Justin Kelly from the Painters and Allied Trades Union was here, he'd be smiling from ear to ear. The idea of building envelope development is not something that people think of in terms of this work. And maybe Aislinn, you can talk a little bit more, because you've heard, the painters and the glazers talk about this. It's not simply about keeping buildings modernized and airtight. It's actually a critical component to decarbonizing the economy. And I know when we had the discussions in Providence, that was a key part of it.
Yeah, I mean, with our state goals that we have, buildings is one of our biggest emission sectors, right? So it's going to be very hard to decarbonize our state if we're not taking a real hard look at our buildings. So as Pat mentioned, we're looking at the whole building envelope. Part of that is some of the energy efficiency measures, right? Is there proper insulation? Do we need to replace the windows? But part of it is also, what is the heating and cooling source? And a big part of that is, what can we do for fuel switching purposes? And in a state like Rhode Island, and especially in a city like Providence, when you have very old buildings, it can be difficult to figure that out. But again, it's not a one size fits all. So when we look at a building like City Hall or like the State House, which If you have been in the state house, you know how hot those rooms get, even though it's 20 degrees outside, and vice versa. So you have to be creative about the ways that you decarbonize that. Part of it is going to be doing some of those energy efficiency measures. Part of it is going to be possibly a thermal energy network where you connect into buildings nearby. But in terms of how do we switch it so fossil fuels are used as perhaps a backup emergency system rather than as the main heating and cooling source. So that's really what we've worked on. And the city of Providence is starting with, or their carbon neutral ordinance is for public buildings, but that's really the work of the state, and part of the climate action strategy is that we need to deploy these alternative heating sources at the scale that we need. So I think for heat pumps right now, like we have a goal of 15,000 heat pump installations a year. And part of it is just being creative about how we do that.
Can I? This is what I told you I was going to do. I was just going to interject.
Listen, you don't need to ask permission. Just jump right in.
You were saying earlier, ask forgiveness rather than permission. To that point, and to pulling a holistic strategy, because it's 1 + 1 = 3, and I use all the metaphors, right? Grab every tool you can, blah blah blah, right? Silvana, who's also in the audience, I'm just going to talk to everyone who's here. It sounds like we have right now open an energy efficiency grant program for small businesses. So it's up to $20,000 if you are a business with revenue under $5 million, and will support the envelope of the building. So if you need windows or insulation or heat pumps or other opportunities to create more of that efficiency, because you're right, we need to get to different energy sources, and we need to make it better and easier, or we need to limit the amount of intake you need for those energy sources. But then as we think about the envelope and just tying to the voucher program that I mentioned, we've funded a couple different companies that are piloting new sensors and different ways to use basically the Internet of Things to identify where there really are areas of weakness in business, or in buildings. We have the standard sort of, you go through and you can look and see how thick the insulation is on the wall based on whatever that gives you, the gray or white, look. But are there ways that we can use some of our other tools in the toolbox to enable more innovations that can then come and support the work being done here? So I just wanted to add a couple random pieces, but sort of when we think about how your point, Pat, that this is a shift in economy, and how are we leveraging all the different tools and all the different types of business growth and business ideas and technology ideas to all drive toward the ultimate goal that we have.
Go ahead, Case.
Just to add to that, no, that's a great program. And we have really great programs in the state. And I think the stat that we use a lot is by 2050, 70% of our buildings that we'll have already been built today, on top of already what is an older housing stock. So it'll have to be taking advantage of those programs. And at the state level, there are pieces of legislation both around building benchmarking, because you just can't track and measure what you're not aware of you're using. And then there's also building performance standards legislation in there. So there's going to be some houses that just need some light touches, and then there's going to be a lot that are going to need deep retrofits.
So, Daniela, I want you to add in a little bit more about the work that's going on, in like these niche markets places in Rhode Island. One of the things you talked about was the subwater autonomous vehicle area, which has just been fascinating to see Rhode Island like develop and capture that market worldwide right here in Rhode Island. And I don't think people know about that right now. And, talk about where we are and maybe some of the potentials for growth in the years to come.
We anticipate, if we are doing our jobs well, 20,000 new jobs in this sector in the next decade, regionally. There are companies that folks may know, like Saab, previously built cars, has now put its global headquarters for autonomous systems in Rhode Island, over in Bristol. They're bringing new jobs in. They're in the same campus with another company that's raised, don't quote me, but about $100 million in the last couple of years. Vaughan, they're expanding. They were in Portsmouth. They're expanding in Bristol. They've got a Tiverton location. They're growing. They're on the hook to us, because Pat knows this because he's on our board. They're on the hook to grow almost 225 new jobs in the next few years, building these systems. There are Havoc AI, Anduril Industries. There are a whole host of companies that we can rattle off names that are individually growing hundreds of jobs in state. And I think, Pat, your point is these are folks who are out actively testing, and they chose Rhode Island because of the natural assets that we have. They're actively testing out in the Narragansett Bay, potentially as we speak. And they're working in collaboration with other companies like Flux Marine, who has built a fully electric outboard engine. So if you ever have gone on or would like to go on a Flux boat, if you've ever been on a boat, you can't hear yourself think, never mind speak to anyone else that you're out with, it is silent. It is a completely enjoyable experience to be out in the water, but their batteries and Flux's technologies are being able to be leveraged by the companies that are putting autonomous systems down underwater. These have big ramifications across the board. We think about defense technology as one, but you can't know bathymetry, you can't know how our waters are changing in temperature if you can't get down deep and understand. We can't know if currents are shifting and what that means for weather patterns if we can't get down deep. These systems have huge implications for what our climate understanding is going to be, which then can impact our climate future. And I'm noting that there are the companies that are around that are helping with the battery systems and the AI systems and the everything else to get here. And they're all here because of it all comes full circle. They're all here because of our natural assets and the ability to get in the water, test, bring it back out, refine it, get back in the water, test, refine it. So we see huge growth. I said 20,000 new jobs expected, huge growth potential, already huge amounts of investment from named companies, companies that I just named that are well known and upstarts that are coming online, and the ability for, to capitalize on the related and legacy companies that we have in the industries that we have. So super exciting, and definitely want more people to know about it, more people to engage. And we do I think some folks maybe are getting out on Friday. There's on water, I think, demonstrations and some of the tech on Friday. So if anybody is able to get to any of those, to those tours through Clean Energy Week, please try to do that.
Thank you. And John, where is geothermal in this mix, and what's the state of development of geothermal in Rhode Island now, and where do you see the potential in 5 years, 10 years, 25 years?
Yeah, so as is often the case, most of our clients are either higher ed, colleges and universities, or K through 12 schools. So they tend to have a little bit longer view than commercial real estate developers. They have some very ambitious decarbonization goals. So I think it's already happening in Rhode Island. I know Brown, for example, has done some pilot testing. They may even have a full system in place. I don't know, we haven't been working with them. And certainly URI, the Narragansett Bay campus, we're well on the way to finishing the design to build a system to serve a couple of buildings there. And then the Kingston campus similarly has some pretty ambitious goals for geothermal. So I won't say that it solves the decarbonization problem on its own, but it can take you, it can get you, it can advance your initiatives really quickly because it is so efficient. So for example, air source heat pumps, which have been kind of dominated the residential market, they're still a very good fit for urban centers where it's hard to find the space to drill enough boreholes to make a geothermal system work. But geothermal is considerably more efficient because you're starting with the ground temperatures, which stay fairly stable at 50 to 55 degrees. It's simple physics that when the air temperature drops to single digits, even in the teens, it gets very difficult to convert that to usable heat in an air source heat pump system. So they're both very efficient, but geothermal has an advantage there. And as you scale up to either a sizable building or a full-blown district, that difference, it's huge in terms of your return on investment ultimately with the system.
Now, John, you said something very interesting there that I think fits into some of the themes of the other panels that have taken place today. And it's the idea that the institutional investors in new technologies or maybe not investors, but those wanting to deploy these type of technologies. It's kind of the opposite end of what Danielle is talking about with startup culture here in Rhode Island. And I think a lot of times when we've talked about what a transition to a carbon-free economy looks like, it's very much centered on the smaller, the nimble, the small idea that we can expand upon and take to the next generation. But in reality, what we're really talking about is that and that the and part of that is oftentimes public sector driving what this economy is looking like, especially in K-12 schools. It's only been less than 10 years since the state of Rhode Island made a decision as a state to reconstruct and rebuild or build from scratch our schoolhouse, our school buildings across the state. It was in 2018 when then State Treasurer Seth Magazine and now Congressman Magazine had put forward a bond initiative so that we could rebuild these schools. Not only is that doing the simple thing of just rebuilding schools that were oftentimes 60, 70, 100 years old at some point, but it's spurring economic development in areas that were not attended to for a generation because we just didn't build new stuff. And the idea that the state or the public sector can drive a change in the economy has been anathema in the United States for so long that it's really taken us almost a complete generation to unlearn economic policy that didn't serve the country well. And I think a lot of times our infrastructure has shown that. But Harry in Aislinn, taking that as like a starting point, where else are we driving the change in this economy? Whether it's from the workforce point of view, whether it's from the labor union as institution point of view, how is that fitting into what the Ocean State is doing to meet our goals on the Act on Climate?
I'll let Harry speak to maybe more of like the labor union structure with his light capacity, but I think one major thing that we do have here in Rhode Island is that just transition component in our Act on Climate. I mentioned this on an earlier panel, but we have the Green Energy Workforce Advisory Committee, we have the labor unions, we have community organizations, we have state agencies coming together, sitting down and figuring out what policies and programs do we need to invest in state to meet our goals, to meet our 2030 Act on Climate, 2040, 2050. I think a big part of that is the green energy, renewable energy work, but I think there's also maybe a misconception around this idea of like, what is a dirty or a green energy job, right? And the truth is that our tradesmen and women have those skills, and if that work is available, they will do that work. If we make the intentional investment into renewables, into longer term projects, people are happy and they're proud and they're excited to do that work. One of the things we hear most often from members out in the field is they love to drive by stuff and say, I built that. So imagine being able to do that to an offshore wind farm, to a solar farm, a thermal energy network in the ground, right? So I think having all of those folks sit down at the same table and plan, like we just don't see that in other states. And I think that is the benefit of Rhode Island being so small. And then we are working on a report that should launch probably next month, looking at where's our workforce going, what are the expected increases, and how do we meet that demand? And in that report, we put forth a couple of policy recommendations, but it's also this idea of we're not necessarily training someone to be a solar installer or a wind technician. We're giving them the full set of skills. We're going to train them to be an electrician. We're going to train them to be a laborer, to be an iron worker. And that way, if those renewable energy jobs are available, they'll go to work on them.
1,000%. I'm going to say something I said in the earlier panel today, and that's we have the workforce, we have the training infrastructure, we have the skill set in our workforce to do this work. We now need the investment to put them to work. And not only with that investment, we need the standards to make sure that when those projects get built, they create good family-sustaining jobs. And that looks like things like apprenticeship utilization, which we talked about in an earlier panel, but I'm going to say again because I think it's extremely important. That signals to our trade unions that they need to start investing in the next generation of workers so that they can bring new people and create new accessibility to, like I said, those family-sustaining jobs. It's things like prevailing wage to make sure that it's not a race to the bottom and that these jobs and that these men and women going to work on these jobs aren't getting paid $15, $10, $20 an hour. They are getting paid a livable wage to support a family.
One of the things I think people don't appreciate, I think it's not that they don't understand, that construction workers are the original gig workers. You know, they'll go from project to project, and without a direction that is laid out in a plan like the Act on Climate or the work that the EC4 is doing for the state strategic environmental plan, it's just catch as catch can. And Rhode Island has this incredible opportunity in front of it by laying out the blueprint for what our new economy is going to look like. And it, you know, as Daniela, as you talked about, as John, as you talked about, that's going to take a whole different mindset in terms of how the state interacts, you know, with industry, with labor, with higher education, but also with the economy itself. And instead of thinking of itself as reacting to economic forces, it's driving economic forces to get to a design goal. John, it looked like you were going to jump in and say something.
Oh, I don't know if it came up in the earlier panel, but I think Aislinn mentioned earlier that geothermal is the one alternative that survived moving from the Inflation Reduction Act to One Big Beautiful Bill. And to maximize the investment tax credit that's available through that bill, it does require both prevailing wage and an apprenticeship program. So our drillers are engaging apprentices. The same with the pipe fitters for that work. So that's built into the bill. And I should mention, since universities and schools are doing so much of this work, one of the significant changes in the IRA compared to geothermal-based incentives from the early 2000s is they did make it available to tax-exempt institutions. It's structured a little different. So instead of an investment tax credit, you're getting a direct payment back. But people are using it. You know, it's really available to anyone, and it's pretty generous. And I guess use it while it's there. Who knows what the future will bring?
Very cool. I'm going to pause here and see if we might have any questions from the audience that you might want to ask the members of the panel. Because if not, I can have them keep going. But I want to give everyone an opportunity to ask a question if they'd like. Yes, sir.
On the doubters and folks about didn't dog codes for the Burian to a 67 house. Then
We have two programs. The vouchers is $75,000 R&D. Research and development, so is available for businesses. So if you're doing something to expand your business model, that might be an opportunity. The energy efficiency program can be something that you might use to support the envelope, you know, if you need to, and that could be for your aquarium, or it has to be a business. So a nonprofit would count. So not like a house that you maintain, but you know, an aquarium business or a nonprofit business or something. I have a random other point, so if we have more questions, we should go. Otherwise, I want to go to talk about ports.
Talk about ports in a minute. You have a question?
that on some that talk about here.
That's a great question. Both, and I think that's an important point. I can be the government person talking about all the stuff that we have, but there's a proposed bond that the governor's proposed that may, if it gets through the General Assembly, will get to voters in November for economic development with a big focus on increasing pad-ready sites, industrial sites to enable more manufacturing locally. But Andrel is one company that's got $150 50,000 square foot location that they just put up in Quonset. Voughton's doing their manufacturing local. That's why they're looking to expand. They've got 45,000 square feet over in Bristol and need more. So a lot of the folks are doing manufacturing here. Not full, not necessarily all of everything they're doing. Andrel has a huge facility in Ohio that's like bigger than the Ohio State's campus kind of thing. Don't quote me, but it's massive, right? But so some, yes. And I think some of that is the R&D, like the new tech development. As you get into the smaller scale, I need 100, I need 1,000. One thing, and I'm going to riff off this to go into my ports point. But Pat, I think something you said a lot of things that I think all fit together. But you talked about the small business startup ecosystem, and then our legacy, predominantly public institutions, private nonprofits that have just a longer lead time and thought, and that P3 public-private partnership kind of concept that really can and probably needs to be the thing that drives locally. And we're seeing that I think in our port structure right now, with Quonset being quasi-public as well, Pravport being quasi in governance, operated privately. But our ports are great spaces. Quonset has a business park right next to it, so we're seeing a lot of our manufacturing happening there or near the water. Obviously, like one of the value adds of doing manufacturing close to water is that you can do your demos and make sure that your product is there or get it shipped out to wherever it needs to be pretty easily. 80% of global goods are traded overseas. And you go into our climate, justice future, most of that is powered by diesel. So as we can move into a new set of energy drivers to get our boats, get our ships to move from port to port, the port infrastructure itself is going to need to change. So one thing you asked me earlier that didn't quite answer was, what are we thinking about, next gen for our Ocean Tech Hub? And a lot of that is how are we setting up the land-based infrastructure, our port infrastructure, to be able to be energy efficient. We don't want our ships to come in, be on land power, and have that be, power that is going to further harm our environment. We don't want them to come in and sit idle on their diesel, because they can't get into their berth as quickly as possible. And if we're moving into more autonomy, we actually have more ability to bring more of that into the electric-based power, which then completely changes how we fit out, how we power, how we move things within the ports. So I think there's going to be a lot of movement. You asked, sort of what's next. So I think there's going to be a lot of movement in our port infrastructure, and that enables and can support our sort of P3 and that startup to government and in between collaborations that can drive some of this forward, not just for like where people are living, but for just general writ large energy consumption in state.
It's one of the most fascinating parts of getting into this work. Listen, I'm just a Zamboni driver that read a couple of books. This is I come at this point from the point of view of a trade unionist and trying to get my members jobs. But when you think about really what that means from a trade unionist point of view, it's about thinking about how the economy interacts with human beings. And when we think about rebuilding or building infrastructure, oftentimes we think of, especially here in Rhode Island, bridges or roads or buildings. And we think about the thing that's immediately in front of us and maybe falling down. When you really think back about what infrastructure is about, it's about thinking about things that aren't there yet, that you need to build to make those things possible. The ports are a perfect example. There's nothing sexy about dredging a harbor. And it's nothing that complex. It's big machines out on the water, taking dirt and soil out of the ground and putting it somewhere else. But if we're ever going to have a robust port system across the whole east coast of the United States, we're going to need to make sure that we're building a port structure and a base system that is efficient enough for a diesel-powered tugboat to turn into an electric-powered tugboat. That takes a lot of people to think about things in a different way of doing it. And that's where the intersection with higher education, with the unions that are thinking about restructuring their apprenticeship programs so they're training people for those things, but also getting government to not think about the crisis to the crisis to the crisis mentality, but thinking about building things that are going to complement what's not there yet. And that's where I think using this idea of setting economic goals like the Act on Climate is driving a conversation in ways that are different than we've done in this country for a very long time. Now, we're kind of coming to the end of our time here. So I've been asking this question of the panelists all day. If there's one thing that you'd like our attendees, whether they're in the room or on the live stream, to take away from this discussion, what do you think that would be so they could go out and tell their colleagues or their friends and their family that would be? And let's start with John and we'll work our way back.
Yeah, I think mainly geothermal is an option. I wouldn't call it a mature industry, but we've learned a lot in the last 5 years or so, really last 20 years or so. And I think it's settling into a good place where we have multiple contractors who can do the work, right? The drilling is the big challenge. How deep can they get, et cetera? But it's mature. We've had a lot of resources coming in from oil and gas, interestingly, that are definitely advancing technologies that allow us to drill deeper, or allow us to drill at an angle so that we can shoehorn a geothermal system into a very tight urban space for that. So like I say, it's not for every site, but with a small investment, you can figure out if it makes sense, and it should be in the toolbox.
I think that we need to really work with our community members to help them see themselves in this transition and also know that these opportunities in the blue economy are available to them. And on the worker side, green economy, blue economy, our workers are ready.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. And also, when we're building an economy, it can't just uplift an industry. It has to uplift the people within it. And labor continues and needs to continue to lead the way on all of these developments to make sure that it's not only uplifting the industry, but uplifting the people as well.
I won't. I was going to talk about a whole nother topic before, but I will just end. I was on another panel and someone said, how do we get the word out about it? Like, how come nobody knows? And I responded, you have to tell them. We do. We up here have to talk about this. But if you go back and say, hey, there are 36,000 jobs in the blue economy of Rhode Island today. Did you know that? Tell your neighbor, tell the folks you know. I tell this story often. I've got a 20-something neighbor living with his parents next door. And I was talking about a couple of the composite companies that are building over in Bristol. I said, oh yeah, they're hiring. He's like, I don't know anything about composites, but I know how to, I went to one of our trade schools. I know trades. I was like, you should go check it out. And then I talked to him a couple of weeks later and he's like, check out my motorcycle. I just bought it. I can get myself to work now. I have a job that pays well, that will get me to work. And the only reason he knew about that was because I opened my mouth while I was throwing the trash out, right? And so it's getting the word out because we do have the talent, we do have the capacities, we have the folks that can be very quickly retrained, that know the trades, know the skills, and just need 2 weeks on the job. And then they can get their own wheels, get themselves to that place of a family sustaining. And it's just because all of us are spreading the word. Because it can't just be us in our little ecosystem of a panel. Go tell your neighbors while you're throwing your trash out.
That might be the most Rhode Island story today. That's fantastic. Let's give our panelists a round of applause and say thank you. Thank you very much for everyone, and thank you for being here.